Over 800 coronavirus cases have been reported at the University of Georgia, but the administration is full steam ahead with in-person learning. NBC News correspondent Ellison Barber joins me now. Ellison, how worried are faculty members on campus? How are they feeling?
They're very worried. I mean, look, this is all a big experiment. And regardless of what administrator we talk to, we've talked to a lot who just anecdotally kind of across the country who will say they are in favor of bringing students back on campus and having in-person classes. But they have acknowledged that this is not riskless. At the University of Georgia, they have seen their cases go up and their percent positive of cases went from 2% to 5% in just 1 week. And there's a chance, there's concern, particularly among faculty members, that those numbers might not be entirely accurate because there's a lag in time in just getting some results. And then there has also been reports that students there are getting COVID-19 tests off campus, which they're able to do. But when they go take those tests, they're using their parents' insurance and sometimes using their parents' home address. So there's concern that perhaps those cases of positive cases might not be being sent over to be counted in the tally at UGA. Here's some more of what faculty as well as health professionals at UGA are saying.
I have significant concerns because I believe that these numbers are actually quite conservative. It's a time lag, so they're old data at this point.
When students go and get this test done and pay for it with their parents' insurance, is taking the address from the form which attributes the COVID case to their parents' home county, not to Athens-Clarke. So as alarming as the numbers from DPH are today for Athens-Clarke County in the last several days, they should be more alarming.
UGA's president has called that recent jump concerning, and in a statement, he urged students, I'm quoting here, to resist the temptation to organize or attend a large social gathering. He's also asked people who are heading out for Labor Day weekend activities to be extra careful. Savannah?
Ellison, yesterday we talked about another university in a different state, the University of Alabama, with 1,200 cases in just under a month. How many coronavirus cases are too many for colleges and universities?
Yeah, I mean, you've reported on schools reopening as well, so I know you know this, but it is sometimes so difficult to just get numbers from a lot of these colleges that are reopening because there is no standard way that anyone is counting or reporting their numbers. So sometimes it's difficult to just get information from these universities and colleges. And then when it comes to getting kind of what their top line is, if you will, to where they say, okay, enough is enough, let's send students home. I have asked that question to many administrators, and almost every time you never get a concrete answer. They'll say something like, we're going to let the data drive our decisions. We'll monitor the data day by day and reassess. But it's hard to get any clear, concrete number. Just some examples for you. If you look at like a couple different schools to try and anecdotally find the answer, I don't think it's any clearer, but I think it's worth looking at. So University of Alabama has around 33,000 undergraduates. As you said, there are 1,200 students at least who have tested positive for COVID-19. They are continuing with in-person classes as far as we know and have no plans to move things entirely online. University of Georgia has about 30,000 undergraduates, close to 800 students currently positive with COVID-19. Same thing. No plans to change to online learning. They're continuing with in-person classes. But James Madison University, they have 22,000 students and about 600 student cases of COVID-19. But they are now moving everything to online starting on Monday. So JMU has been open about a month longer than UGA and Alabama. They have less cases, but they're making the decision to move to online. UGA and Alabama, they're not. Savannah?
Ellison, I also think it's worth noting that we've now been reporting that 1,200 number at the University of Alabama for a couple days. You pointing out there's 33,000 students, they're still going to classes. That number is likely higher by now, and we just don't know yet. Now let's talk about holiday. You mentioned Labor Day weekend. We're coming up on this long weekend. Obviously, a lot of people looking forward to it. You can imagine what that's going to look like on a college campus. What is the federal guidance for colleges on what to do over this holiday weekend?
Yeah, so Dr. Deborah Birx from the White House Coronavirus Task Force was actually talking about this yesterday. She was in Michigan having a meeting with the governor there, and as she was talking to reporters, she spoke directly to students about Labor Day. Listen here.
To every university student out there, if you have done something that is not so great and so smart, and you've been in a crowd without a mask, you're likely to become infected. Do not go home to your parents or your grandparents over Labor Day weekend and spread the virus to them. And do not go out in your communities without a mask on. For universities where we know children, we know young adults are out and about, they need to really have a testing strategy. Because if you find 200, there could be 2,000 in some of these large universities.
It's interesting, right now you hear a lot of adults in power talking about the need for students to do more, and perhaps rightly so, to not, if they're going out to bars, not go to bars where they can't socially distance, try to limit going out. But one thing that I do think is interesting, when I was talking to one of the professors at the University of Alabama the other day, he told me he felt like there is a bit of a shift in blame being placed on students at colleges and universities that are having these outbreaks, and he felt like that wasn't fair. His argument was that it is unrealistic, in his view, to expect young adults, particularly when they're in a congregated college-like setting, to not socialize when they've been at home for so long, and that the adults in charge should have anticipated that better. In his view, that's why that they shouldn't have been brought back onto campus. But either way, he said he feels like what we're seeing right now is a bit of a shift in blame and putting it more on students. He didn't feel like it's fair, but obviously you're hearing from Dr. Birx as well as other college administrators urging young people, young adults at college, to make sure that they are taking extra precautions to try and curtail some of these outbreaks we've seen.
Definitely something valid to point, Allison, that these students have just been cooped up at home, a lot of them with their families, with their parents, and now they're back at school. How much are we expecting here? Thank you so much for keeping an eye on these important numbers.
You bet.
Hey, NBC News viewers, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down here, and click on any of the videos over here to watch the latest interviews, show highlights, and digital exclusives. Thanks for watching.